Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the forthcoming novel Brotherless Night.
So, Sugi, where were you when you heard about the Supreme Court's leaked draft opinion to overturn Roe v. Wade?
I was online, as I always am, doom scrolling. That's all I do, other than grading. But there's doom scrolling, and then there's Roe scrolling, which really feels to me like doom scrolling DEFCON 1.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like people have been saying that this was going to happen, has been warned about, and I know that it should not be as a surprise, but I really thought that the Republicans did. I don't know what I thought. I thought that they would. I feel like this is a terribly dangerous thing to do. And I thought, and not just because I think it's dangerous for everyone who's being affected. I think it's dangerous for the Republicans to do. And I thought that they would not do it. Maybe.
Well, it's not clear to me that this is over. I mean, that's a draft opinion. So I hope it's not over. And I feel like I've seen people kind of cautioning against acting like it's over. And also talking about ways to make, in a potentially post-Roe v. Wade world that we've been warned about, and that many people have predicted that there are a lot of things that can be done to make abortion as safe as possible and as accessible as possible. And we'll just have to think about other systems to do that. But anyway, jumping the gun.
I want to say one thing, though, like the language that you see in Alito's opinion, which has been talked about on other podcasts, and how aggressive it is. And also just what's been going on with Clarence Thomas and his wife and her role in the January 6th insurrection. It's very hard not to, and Thomas was recently out saying, like, I feel like the leak has ruined the credibility of the court. And I'm like, no.
You guys ruin the credibility of the
court. You're doing it.
You giant tool.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're jumping the gun a little because we have actually two wonderful guests joining us today to discuss this and to discuss writing about abortion. Shelly Oria is the editor of the new McSweeney's anthology, I Know What's Best for You, a multi-genre collection of writing in response to the reproductive freedom crisis. And Kristen Arnett is a contributor to the anthology. First, Kristen is a queer Florida writer. Her recent novels include With Teeth, published by Riverhead Books in June 2021, and Mostly Dead Things, published by Tin House in 2019. Mostly Dead Things was a New York Times bestseller and a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in lesbian fiction. Kristen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're also joined by Shelly Oria. Shelly is the author of New York 1, Tel Aviv 0, and the editor of Indelible in the Hippocampus, Writings from the Me Too Movement, which McSweeney's published in 2019. In 2017, Clean, her digital novella that was commissioned by McSweeney's and We Transfer, a favorite service of ours, which we use all the time, received 2 Lovie Awards from the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences. Her fiction has appeared in the Paris Review and on selected shorts at Symphony Space and received a number of awards and has been translated into several languages. Shelly lives in Brooklyn, New York. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So happy to be here.
So Shelly, you began working on this collection in 2019 when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, RIP, was still alive. A tremendous amount has been written about abortion rights between then and now, and most of it is legal and political analysis, which is important, but that's not what we do on this podcast. We talk about how literature informs politics, and you and Kristen decided to approach this political issue through art. So I guess we'd like to start off by asking both of you why.
This is something I've been thinking so much about, obviously, with these last 2 books, that it's going to be close to 5 years that I've been working on both of them together. So this is a question that comes up a lot, and I think, often when it comes up, I kind of want, my pull is to answer most honestly first and just say, I made this book because McSweeney's asked me to. I think the contributors wrote their pieces. Kristen can correct me in a minute if that's wrong, but I think that's right for her too. She wrote that piece because I invited her to write it. And it sort of sounds like a silly answer that almost makes me think like when I used to teach, and I think a lot of teachers know this moment when if you make the mistake of asking students like, what made you choose this class? And always at least some dude is like, well, it's at 5 p.m. and it works with my schedule. So it sort of feels like that kind of answer that's like, okay, you're saying a non-thing, but it doesn't feel that way to me. I think this answer points to the responsibility that publishers have, that editors have, that anyone curating or producing a cultural space has, if we want art and literature to respond to moments of crisis and to social injustice. Now, do we want art and literature to do that? Why do we want art and literature to do that is sort of a much larger conversation. I think for me, and I don't think any one individual artist or writer has that obligation to make work about anything they're not pulled to make work about, just because it's in the news and it's upsetting. That's at least my view. And I know there's sort of this kind of easy cynicism that we also hear a lot sometimes of like, art doesn't change the world and nobody reads books anymore, and like those things. And there's truth and validity to those as well, for sure. But I think ultimately our beliefs, in my view, for the most part, are choices we make. So I can just say I make the choice to believe that art does matter and that literature matters, that books matter, kind of in ways that maybe we can't even name or quantify or explain in real time and can see more in retrospect. And I make the choice to have that belief because I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning otherwise, So yeah, I can say more about that.
But certainly art does things that, there's plays in here, there's poems, there's fiction, there's also creative nonfiction. But I mean, fiction does things that a news story isn't going to do. I think there are special things that art accesses that are different. But I just wondered and obviously, if you choose to do an anthology like this, you're choosing to make art, right? You're saying this isn't going to be, there are many other kinds of books you could write about this subject, but we want to do it in art, And I wonder if, Kristen, for you, what you felt was special about the way that art can approach this particular subject and offer comfort or offer in learning or offer none of those things.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. Shelly did approach me about taking part in this anthology. I feel very lucky that I was able to be part of this anthology because I think like it's, we've talked about this, Shelly and I, it's like, it feels like a little bit of a community and a conversation, like an ongoing conversation inside of this anthology that feels like it's open and able to be accessible to further conversation, which is my favorite way to access literature, is ongoing questions and conversation, which I think is my favorite thing about art, is furthering a conversation or like finding not a better way to ask the question, but a better way to figure out how to ask a different question, maybe. So when Shelly asked me if I'd be willing to contribute to this, I was like, this is a great way for me to think about how I want to think about fiction. I write a lot about like what I call like the lesbian domestic. So I was like, okay, like I try and write a lot about bodies, like lesbian bodies in Florida specifically. So thinking about how I would write a story that involves like a lesbian couple and thinking about how I would involve reproductive rights, I was like, well, it's just kind of like sitting there in the background all the time. So another thing I like to think about too, in terms of fiction and art, is like the everyday lived experience, like what a day-to-day lived experience looks like, and how reproductive rights sits inside those things. It just sits there regardless of if we're thinking about it or not. So in writing this story, I found it, I was like, oh, this is like a thing that feels very deeply significant to me, but I started thinking about it in ways that I hadn't before in terms of fiction, where I was like, okay, what if I think about it a little closer? Like, what if this is a couple who's like, trying to conceive, and then like, what would that be like if the conception went in a way that they did not want for themselves, and like, what would that look like specifically in Florida? And I grew up in a very conservative evangelical household in Florida where the reproductive rights were discussed very consistently. So it's like something I was like deeply familiar with in the other aspect of it growing up, but thinking about it in terms of fiction, I felt like I was coming at it from another viewpoint, which felt helpful to me. I was like, oh, I'm relearning how to ask the question. And that felt like, to me, in terms of like making art, deeply significant, because I'm always really I would say I'm a person who never feels like I really know anything about anything, but I love figuring out a way to like, maybe that's the librarian brain I have as a librarian, but I'm like, I love to think about like how I can like ask the question a different way and re-ask the question. So I felt like this was like, and it felt like a safe place to do that. This was like an anthology where it's like Shelly was very careful, and I felt like consistently like held and felt like I'm like, okay, I can like explore this in a way that like maybe I would be nervous about in other capacities.
I mean,
makes me happy to hear.
Should. The other thing that I noticed reading this is like what fiction can do, and creative nonfiction, is it particularizes an experience. So you're dealing with a human being and a person and a full life. And like in Kristen's stories, which we're going to hear from in a minute, a couple who've got concerns and loves and worries and all sorts of particular things, instead of having the conversation on a sort of philosophical level where people immediately drop back into positions that are well worn, right? And so I feel like that is an important thing that this anthology does. I don't know if that's something you were hoping for, Shelly.
Oh, for sure. And I'll add, I mean, in a way that touches on the choice to do a multi-genre as opposed to creative nonfiction is, I think, part of what you were kind of maybe getting at there. But I also want to add, this in a broader way of like why, what can art do? Like why respond to political issues with art or with books in general? That I think, trying to think of how to put it exactly, but basically that art and literature can capture nuance and complexity in ways that other forms of social activism sometimes struggles to. I think, in the political sphere, when it comes to activism, we know that clarity and goal is crucial. A campaign, a protest, anything in that realm needs to have a lot of clarity of goal. And I think when we think of so much of what we're talking about here, like when you have that kind of clarity of goal, sometimes what gets sacrificed or the casualties of that are nuance and even complexities. And so, if you want to make the point of like, hey, these aggressions toward women and women's bodies are part of a larger context, the idea that a society in which sexual assault is rampant, and the fact that that same society is now policing women and women's bodies in a way that robs them of their agency and bodily autonomy and like forces them to stay pregnant when they don't wish to, like, that's not some weird coincidence, right? That these two things are happening in the same society. So there's like a lot of mechanisms in our society kind of keeping women in their place and keeping women, and especially women of color, and especially queer women, and especially women with disabilities, having less power than men. And so if you want to make that point, I would suggest that books stand a much better chance than politics. Whenever, this is just one example, but if you're trying to sort of capture any kind of nuance or complexity, I think that art has something to offer to that conversation. Or is it just a better medium? It's a better equipped medium to tackle nuance.
Kristen, I wonder if you could read to us from your story, The Babies.
I am excited to read from this, so I'll go ahead and just read like a short section. This is two women who are married to each other that have been trying to have a baby, and they have discovered that one of them has discovered that she is pregnant, and so she's trying to figure out where to hide the pregnancy test, and she decides to hide it inside a jar of peanut butter because her wife loves to have a snack when she comes home from work, even if they're going to go out to eat or if they're going to have dinner. So that's what we'll be starting from. "Let's go out to eat. I'm starving," Julie said. She ran her hands through her short, dark hair. Her cheeks were all pink from the heat. Her wife had never looked better than she did in that 3-second span, flicking up her hair until she looked like a goofy little porcupine. That is the mother of my child, Shauna thought. The parent of our kid. We're going to have a baby with spiky porcupine hair. A Julie Shauna baby. Why don't you have a quick snack? Shauna replied. Julie got out the peanut butter and slapped a loaf of bread on the counter. She was aggravated, Shauna could tell, but her wife wouldn't ever say anything about it. She pushed conflict down until it rested like an ulcer in her guts. Her wife was a marketing manager for a chain of local coffee shops. She spent most of her time being on for her clients and for her coworkers. When she got home, she deflated, got soft or testy, depending on the day and her mood, and most of the time needed at least an hour before she could hold a conversation. Shauna's father had been that way too. It had been especially bad when her mother had been going through her miscarriages. There'd been multiple. Stop thinking about that. This is a happy day, she reminded herself. Julie was hunting around for something to spread the peanut butter. Shauna handed her a butter knife and a small plate. Just a paper towel, Julie said, and then she unscrewed the lid to the jar and saw the pregnancy test. When she pulled it free, it made a wild suction sound, obscene like flatulence, and they both laughed hysterically. "Oh my God," Julie said. They screamed and then they hugged. Julie put her hands on Shauna's belly as if she could maybe feel something in there. And they laughed again because there was peanut butter on everything. Peanut butter on their hands and clothes, peanut butter on the counter, peanut butter all over the pregnancy test. Dandelion, the cat, began licking peanut butter off the countertop. The peanut butter dotted above her lip and gave her a mustache, which made them laugh even harder. I'll stop there.
Kristen, thank you so much. I love that we're the first place that you've read from that story because I love it. And I'm really curious, and we've gotten at this a little bit already, but I'm curious about the kinds of conversations you two had about abortion and the language around it and the history of its depiction in literature during the writing and editing of your piece. And Shelly, I'm curious about what you saw in this story when you first read it and just a little bit about the editorial process between the two of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I could start off for the two of us and say, like, Shelly was very like a beautiful, it was honestly one of the best editing processes I've ever had. It was very careful. It was my first time as a fiction writer, honestly, as a writer in general, writing about something as like particular as abortion, specifically about like two people going through something where they had wanted to have a baby and like what that would look like when you lose that baby, and what it would be like in Florida specifically to try and like go through and be like, what's the medical process around the body look like to try and deal with that. And I felt like in talking with Shelly about it, it was a lot of back and forth and like careful conversation about like, what is like the intimacy of these two women look like? Because that felt first and foremost like the most important, I think, is like what their conversations look like with each other. And then like, you know, like the bigger world on the outside, like kind of sitting around it, which to me a lot of times just feels like Florida. Maybe it's like a third generation Floridian. Like it feels like I live here and like a lot of things are just sitting around me all the time. And so it felt like a lot of like very careful back and forth about like how we can bring out the nuance of grief, because that was like a story to me that felt like very much about like grief and like for something that was wanted. Like this was a pregnancy that was wanted, and what does it look like when one person that's in a relationship loses that baby, and how does the conversation happen between the two when one is the body carrying the baby and the other is the body that wanted it also but is not like holding it. And I think Shelly was very thoughtful about that process, but I'd love to hear, Shelly, what you think about it too.
Well, thank you for that. I think, well, first I just want to say, I want to give a shout out to Amy Somerton, who was my assistant editor on this project. And I think, you know, when you're an quote unquote editor on a project like that, most of the work you do, or that I did at least, is not the actual editing. And for the actual editing, Amy did a ton of it too. So she was also part of our process. So it was kind of like the three of us. So just to give her kind of a voice in this, sort of, or to try to, or at least credit, if not a voice. I think I can say, first of all, that for me, I fell in love with this story right away, before like just a few lines in, when I realized what it was, that it was two women having a baby together. That also, I don't think we got into that, but the way that these particular two women are having a baby is that it's the woman carrying the baby and the other woman's egg. So kind of making that, in terms of the book that I wanted to make, telling that kind of queer story, I was already in, like, before anything. But I also felt really, really excited. It's very hard to find the right language when talking about this topic.
Sure.
So excited is the word I was about to use, and that is the wrong word to use here. But I felt that the resonance, let me put it that way, of also this particular story that, as Kristen alluded to, they find themselves going to an abortion clinic for a pregnancy that they very much wanted. And I think it's, if I have the detail right, it's like 3 years or something that they had tried to conceive. And then to have to confront these anti-abortion protesters in this kind of moment, there's something so powerful about that to me, that becomes this kind of metaphor for the blindness, for the audacity of thinking that you know anything about another person's story, body, their decisions. Like, there's something about that that moment that just captures that larger problem, because arguably that is always, always, always true, that you never know, these protesters never know anything about the women that they're yelling at. And in particular, there's this one moment in the story where the protester kind of shoves her child in Sean and Julie's face, and to make the point of like, how can you do this to a child? Meanwhile, the child looks terrified. And so this sort of terrible darkness and irony of that moment, which to me, it sort of ties to a much larger conversation, but it's something that pops up for me so much, is the use of like the children. We see it now with like trans rights and, you know, the fight over that. And in so many ways, like the kind of hypocritical use of the children's safety. So there's something about that moment too, that in a way is like the core, not only of this particular story, but so much of what I was going for with the book.
I don't know if either of you saw this, but there was sort of like a meme circulating that was sort of talking about in the wake of the leaked opinion about overturning Roe v. Wade, like that talking about the unborn is extremely convenient because they haven't done anything. And it was sort of like that, you know, they won't protest, they won't raise their own voices, and that, you know, they don't need anything, they haven't asked you for anything. And so it's like a very convenient sort of set of people for whom to advocate. And I just couldn't help but think about that as I was reading Kristen, your very poignant story, where like, yeah, I was just thinking about the instrumentalization of children as a weapon of argument for other things, which is, I think, a thing that you can see in actually all sorts of movements, and not just the anti-abortion politics that we see around us.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just add, you know, that story is a really good example of what we were talking about at the beginning of the show, that art provides an opportunity to particularize an issue, right? And then create an awareness that, like, that the normal discussion, the Republicans and the right who are opposed to abortion rights want it to always be like a specific, the general case of a woman who wants to get rid of a baby because they think it's inconvenient, and this is all, you know, like, no, there are many, many, many reasons here, and you're not thinking in any sorts of nuance. And so creating this sort of particular case for these two women, and that moment that you talked about with it, when the woman shoves the child in front of them, of course they want nothing more than to have this child, right? Have a child like that, you know. And so it's a cruel act,
and to terrify
way,
that
right?
child.
Yeah. And so it's there's that is the kind of cruelty that I think that a story like that gets across very well. I just wanted to compliment that. Shelly, you not only edited the anthology, but you also contributed to it. I wondered if you could read to us from your story, We Bled All Winter.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for asking. Just thinking of how to kind of set it up, what you maybe need to know, or what the listeners need to know. So this is a story. The story is quite vast and complex, and it has 3 sections, which are 3 different points of view. And I'll this section that I'll read is from the first from part 1, where the narrator is Israeli, her girlfriend is Palestinian. They're both undocumented, living in the States, undocumented, currently living with the girlfriend's relative. And the narrator had an abortion not that long ago. She found herself pregnant after their former boss raped her. The added talk about complexity and nuance there is that before this incident of sexual assault, she did flirt with him. They actually made out once, which was cheating on her girlfriend, which her girlfriend does not know about. So that's kind of, I think, all you need to know here. Oh, and now he's been, that's a lot of setup, but it's quite a complicated story. The man has his own idea of what happened and has this whole fantasy. He thinks they're going to give the child up to adoption, and he wants to have the baby. So he finally tracked them down, and she's having a conversation with him upstairs at the relative's apartment, and is coming back down to their space. When I came back down, Jasmine was in the kitchen, and everything smelled like fried onion and sumac. "How'd it go?" she asked, with her back to me, cooking. "Fine," I said. "Tell me," she said. Her voice was cheerful. Everything felt wrong, but I understood we were pretending that this was no big deal, and I wanted to contribute. "Not much to tell," I said. "Now he knows." I shrugged, though she couldn't see. "Took a while, though," my girlfriend said. I shrugged again. "I got into the whole fake clinic story," I said, which was true. At the end of our call, I told Ohad the story of how Jasmine and I made an appointment first with an abortion clinic that turned out to be a creepy anti-abortion center. They read to us from the Bible and kept referring to us as friends no matter what we said. It probably took us longer than it should have to realize we were in the wrong place. across the street from an actual clinic in a building that looked identical. I told Ohad this story like it was a funny anecdote. I mentioned their sign, which read, "Plan Your Parenthood." "Why would you tell him that story?" Jasmine asked, and she turned around then with such sharpness that she knocked a jar of olive oil off the counter. It shattered with a spectacular sound, the promise of tiny shards for weeks. I got up to help her clean, but Jasmine's arm stretched out to stop me, and I paused, still by the table. "What's the point of you getting in this mess?" she said, but she didn't move. We looked at each other. "He was crying," I said. I didn't know how to get him to stop crying. Also, I accidentally said I had a miscarriage, sort of, and didn't know how to correct myself. My girlfriend's face asked if I was joking, and my face said, "Nope, totally serious." She shook her head, and now I couldn't read her face. In a way, it was all so ridiculous, and Jasmine often found absurdity hilarious. A part of me imagined she might laugh now, that we might laugh together. But she said, "So you lied to him before you told him the truth?" I said, "Not exactly." I don't think she heard me. She said, "In that horrible place, we lost a crucial week thanks to them. We were so upset. How's that a joke?" I said, "We made it in time." I tried to smile. Yeah, everything could have been much worse. Only one day later, the second trimester cut off, but I was trying to remind Jasmine that didn't happen. "Not the point," she said. She looked at me and her eyes welled up. I walked into the puddle of oil and I didn't slip, and I hugged her and she let me. I'm gonna stop here.
Thank you so much. It really is such a complex story, and I so appreciate its nuance. And I also was especially interested in your story because a couple of years ago, a friend asked me to be in an ad for Unrestrict Minnesota, and this involved my going to a place and sort of being given a bunch of information and then interviewed about it. And it was for a campaign to spread awareness that crisis pregnancy centers, which is what they're sometimes called, existed. And I had prior to this very odd experience, which apparently featured me on a billboard somewhere in Minneapolis, and I never saw it. But like, I had no idea that these crisis pregnancy centers existed. And your story includes not only the perspective of the couple that you just read about, but also the perspective of Ohad, the boss to whom you referred. And I wondered if you could read that paragraph as well.
Oh, sure. And now I think I don't need setup at all. I think I did all the setup.
I think
before.
you did.
So this is from his perspective. Later, I tell her, oh, I still need a little bit of setup. He's married, and he managed to convince his wife. So he came, by this point in the story, he came clean to his wife. So his wife, who's in the scene, is aware of his perspective, which is that they hooked up. Later, I tried to tell her more. This is my dude voice. I hope it's okay that I'm reading this in my dude voice. Later, I tried to tell her more, though she's asked no questions. I feel the need to hear myself say the word abortion, relay everything I just learned so my brain can begin to accept this new reality. My wife is on her laptop working, but she nods at me. I'm listening, she says when I pause. But the only moment she really listens is when I mention that place that masqueraded as a clinic. Katerine stops typing. It's a huge issue, these fake clinics, she says in her activist voice. Do you know about this? These crisis pregnancy centers are popping up all over the place, misleading women into believing they have more time than they actually do to get an abortion, scaring women with false medical information. I tune out while Katerine goes on like that for a while, as she does about anything she deems an injustice. They mostly go after uneducated women and women with no means. You said your friend was an immigrant? My friend. I'm not sure how to respond to this question. Well, in this case, nothing happened, I say. They figured it out, she and her girlfriend, and they left. Caused quite a scene on their way out, from what I understand. I know I'm being foolish, but it feels like Katerina is taking their side over mine. Good for them, she says. Good for them for not letting those assholes get away with their bullshit. I'm gonna stop you.
as an issue. I wondered if you could talk to us about those crisis pregnancy centers, and if you did research into them, and how you chose to write about them.
Yeah, I think at some point in the process of making this book, I became aware of it, and it creeped me the hell out. I was just going to curse, but I don't know if we can do that.
This is an explicit
really?
podcast. Feel free.
If
We
we
can't
can
curse on this
fuck.
broadcast. We're gonna have
Feel
to
free to talk
cancel
about the
5
fucking
years worth
pregnancy
of
centers.
episodes.
Oh, that just got you really excited. I'm going to take it up a notch with the cursing.
Bring it.
The crisis
I mean,
pregnancy
this
centers
topic,
infuriate
right?
me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. They're infuriating in a way that warrants some language. But I was creeped out to the point where like it was in my dreams for a while. When you first learn of this thing, it's those details in my story are real. Like they often will be right in front of a Planned Parenthood clinic or a legitimate abortion clinic. They would make buildings that look like it and put signs that look like it. They really got out of their way to confuse women into thinking they're going into an abortion clinic. And often, and that tactic too of making a woman be like, look, you just have to consider it. Let's just make your appointment for this date. And what's the rush? You can take your time. And they make her appointment for like 2 days after whatever the cutoff point is in that state. So things like that are like diabolical, like really just so terrible. And so yeah, that became something that once I became aware of it and felt like we're not talking about this enough, like I was so creeped out. And I should say, at least at the time that I was researched it for writing the forward for this book, I hope I'm not misquoting the number. I think there was something like 2,700 of them, which is more than 3 per each remaining abortion clinic in this country. So it's just so scary. So yeah, I mean, this became something that I definitely wanted to make sure is in the book. In general, this process from my end ended up being kind of a mirror image to what my process was with the previous anthology with Indelible in the Hippocampus, that I won't go into the inception story for that book, but it basically all started from a story I wrote. Whereas in this case, I really waited until the very last minute where I had compiled the book and was able to look at it and see what it was doing and what it was not yet doing that I wanted it to do, and kind of made a very bizarre prompt for myself as a writer that was like, of things that either weren't in the book or weren't enough in the book for what I wanted. So it was like male point of view, queerness, sexual assault, healthcare for immigrants, the Palestinian plight. Like it was a very bizarre prompt. And probably first on that list was like fake clinics. So crisis pregnancy centers. I always just say fake clinics, which is what they are. So I basically then which is why the story ended up having 3 points of view, because then you look at that list and you're like, no problem, go. Just trying to kind of weave all of these different points into one cohesive narrative.
That is, I mean, yeah, that's one of the other things that comes up is the healthcare for undocumented people, because one of the ways that people try to kind of influence them is by threatening their status, which is, I feel like, a part of the discussion that we haven't really given enough airtime to. And then the other thing that I realized about these crisis pregnancy centers when I was doing this thing for Unrestrict Minnesota was that they're partially taxpayer funded, which like just made me in some places, wow. I think. And so like I'm paying for them. I'm still just, I mean, the way that money and the way that funding is routed away from things that would actually improve reproductive freedoms and to sort of scam artists like this is just appalling. And so this book does have this incredible breadth and depth. And in addition to the two of you, there are a ton of fantastic writers, including several who have been on the show, like R.O. Kwan and Deborah Landau and Devlin Unferth. And they're also, all writing different stories using different tones and styles and structures and genres. This is a multi-genre anthology. And I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about how your thinking on this subject was changed or influenced by other stories that you read in here. And Kristen, I wonder if we can start with you.
I think one of the things was that I was interested to know, like, because I mean, in contributing to this, I was like, okay, like I don't know what other people are going to be contributing, but I was like writing from a fiction standpoint and writing about something I hadn't written about before felt, I think we said this before, it's like exciting is not the right word for it. Exciting is not the right word. I felt,
Challenging in a good way.
Yeah, that kind of like where like the creative mind wakes up in this kind of way where it's like, okay, this is a challenge and this is asking me to do something or think in a way or ask a question in a way that I haven't asked before. And I wasn't totally sure like who all was going to be in the anthology, but I trusted Shelly to know that like it would be a community of writers where we would be like really, because the thing I think a lot about like art is like I just want people to be asking a lot of questions. So I think this is a lot. And so now seeing like how the collection sits together, we were having a back and forth with Rachel Eliza Griffiths the other day, and I was like, this is a back and forth in a way where it's like I feel like even though we weren't like talking to each other while we were making this art, it still feels like we were in conversation. I was like, I feel like we were talking to each other even without like necessarily like reading each other's art at the time. So sitting and looking like what the anthology looks like now, it's like even though I wasn't in direct conversation when I was making my story, it still feels like it sits beside those works and feels like they're talking to each other and touch each other. But what do you, Shelly, I mean, you're like from an editing process. What do you think about that?
I think it's such a fun, and that where here the word exciting is appropriate. It's very exciting and fun to see the magic of the kind of the creative process with a project like that, where I kind of cast a really wide net and I in terms of the topics, and I kind of said, reproductive freedom, like anything reproductive freedom that a writer might want to respond to in any literary genre, like contraception, surrogacy, fertility, child freeness, and of course abortion, and anything else. Like I really wanted writers to have that sense of creative freedom. And then to kind of see from approaching it that way, and then kind of seeing how it all comes together and how there is a kind of conversation that happens between different writers and artists that like Kristen was saying, like aren't having that conversation in a direct way. And yet I have the privilege of like seeing that they are in conversation with each other, and again, kind of trying, at least in the editorial and curatorial process, to kind of pull on threads so that different pieces are talking to each other in some way. Ideally, hopefully, if I did my job well without being redundant, but while echoing or holding each other in different ways.
So one of the threads that I was really interested in as I was reading the anthology was the presence of queerness and just kind of multiple stories and the way that it affects the way that reproductive freedoms are affecting members of the queer community. And I saw this in so many pieces, and they were in conversation in such interesting ways. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about queer writing in this anthology.
Now I'm realizing, okay, that is putting me on the spot for a second, because in part because I'm thinking of, it was something I was so aware of in inviting writers, but then I'm thinking of several stories we just mentioned, like Rachel Eliza Griffith and Kirsten Vallis Quaid, and a lot of queer writers who ended up writing pieces that don't center queerness, and their pieces are incredible. And I wanted them, of course, to have that freedom. So when I'm trying to focus on Donetta Lavinia Grays is a playwright whose play in the piece is from the perspective of a trans man who's pregnant. So that's another important example of queerness from a different perspective. I think both my story and Kristen's story also kind of tackle the sort of the queer experience in the context of reproductive freedom from different angles. So those are kind of the first three that come to mind, but there's definitely a bunch more that I'm just not thinking of. So let me just check for a second. Another example of a queer writer in this book is Sarah Gerard, and again, her piece doesn't focus on that, which is sort of something that I love. It again goes back to—
That was great.
Those are two different questions, right? If we want to talk about like a queer presence in the table of contents, that's like going on like 40% of this list. And if we want to talk about queer pieces, I think it's just the three that we mentioned. So the play that I mentioned, and then Kristen's in my piece.
Okay. In the real world here, things look bleak. Things look bleak. Also, I don't know what that means, but Maybe they look that way too. That's a combination of bleak and broken, I guess.
Honestly, amazing. Yes.
Bloken and bleak.
Things are bloken and bleak. Art is vibrant and crucial, but we also need votes. We need laws. We need more Supreme Court justices, maybe. We definitely could use a few more Democrats in the Senate. Senate Democrats recently failed to pass a bill that would protect abortion rights nationwide, partly because of Joe Manchin, the lone Democrat to vote against it. A recent CNN poll shows that 66% of Americans do not want Roe overturned. And there are indications that the GOP is concerned about how this issue might play in the 2022 midterms. We haven't talked a lot about the politics of this issue, but we're going to talk about it now. What is your view of the current political state of this debate? Presuming Roe is overturned, what happens next? Kristen, we'll start with you.
Oh my goodness, what a question. I mean, I think it's something that like we have to think about. I mean, it's a body issue, it's a safety issue. I mean, if it's overturned, people are still having abortions. I mean, it's something that will happen regardless. It just will happen with less safety and less care. I mean, it's something that happened previous, and it's just something that will continue to occur with all kinds of bodies. You know, it's like regardless of like gender and like orientation, like abortions will continue to happen. So it's like something where it's like, just because it's not legal doesn't mean it's not occurring. So I don't know. It's tough. Yeah, I guess it's just those things will happen, but with less safety and less care and with harm to people, which is a terrible thing to consider and think about.
Yeah, I think to Kristen's point, I'm just trying to think of where I'm quoting this from, because I've been mostly just reading and listening to like all of my content in the last 2 weeks has been about this topic. So now I'm not sure where I'm quoting this from, but I heard on a podcast, someone was saying like the best case for abortion rights is what it looks like when abortion is illegal. So to Kristen's point, like the only real consequence is women's safety is decreased significantly, and it's going to be a shit show that I think we can kind of all
I think that's a good way to describe it, a shit show. I mean, to be fair, it already is. Like there's things were dire when I started working on this book and started getting to just learning a little bit more about the topic. I was already like really freaked out. I mean, I think we need to only the fact that the Dobbs case, the Mississippi case that is up before the Supreme Court is the clinic in the case is the one last remaining clinic in the state of Mississippi. What more do you need to know to understand that if Roe v. Wade is overturned, this is the culmination of such a long process of escalation and deterioration in terms of abortion rights. But I also want to, if we're thinking ahead to what it's going to look like, I want to mention the Bridget Alliance, which is our partner, or rather the publisher's partner in this book. And they're part of a network of such organizations. They help facilitate travel. They arrange and fund travel for people all over the country that need to travel for abortion care. And so when you ask, what is it going to look like? I think a lot like that. I think a lot of organizations like that will step up as much as they can. No doubt on the other side, I think, when they're saying now like, oh, what's the problem? It's just going to go back to the states. Not only is that so ignorant in terms of the number of women who cannot travel for various reasons. And of course, that always falls to women of color more, to women with less means more, to younger women more, like et cetera, et cetera. And then again, thank God that we do have, I don't know if thank God is the right choice of words here, but I am grateful that these organizations exist that help with that. Totally lost my train of thought there, but it's easy to get distracted when thinking about what it's going to look like. Oh, I guess I was making the point that they're saying now, oh, it's just taking it back to the states, but their efforts to block it then on a state level are already in full swing. And also obviously from the legal standpoint too, they will try to ban it and not have it be up to the states the minute they can. So it's all such bullshit, which I just learned I'm allowed to say. So let me say it with all my heart, this is such bullshit. Yeah.
Well, on that cheery note, but there is no real cheery note when we're talking about what's happening here. We do want to thank you for this conversation, and we want to encourage our listeners to pick up I Know What's Best for You, the anthology that we've been discussing. If you pre-order the book, you'll also get its international ebook supplement, I Know What's Best for You All Over the World, which features 16 writers and artists from around the globe.
Shelly and Kristen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.